Hello, my fellow troglodytes. In this exercise, you can learn to create a very dynamic online quiz, test, or exam software. The main objective is to give the user multiple choice questions one at a time in sequence and grade them at the end of the exam. Now, the multi-dimensional array tutorial from yesterday is going to come into play within this application build. Open up your favorite code editor, create an example.html file. We'll put an h2 element, make sure we close it, and then underneath that we're going to put a div element. Now let's give them both IDs so we can target them with JavaScript to populate them with the data they need. And that's where we're going to show the user the line of which question they're on out of how many total questions there are. And this div will give an ID equal to test, because that's where we're going to actually render the test questions in sequence, one after another, starting with question number 1. Whew! We're done writing the HTML, and that was tough. Now I'm going to go up into the style element, and I'm going to put a rule that's going to affect that div with an ID of test. So all of these CSS properties will be applied, and I'm only using border and padding. So that way, if I, for instance, put the word hello in my div, and then I look at this in my favorite browser, I get this result. And that's where my test questions are going to appear. But you don't have to have any data in either of those elements, because our JavaScript is going to be populating those elements with data. So the first thing we'll do is initialize some variables that our application is going to require. So I'm going to type in var pose, and pose is short for position, which is going to keep track of where the user is in the test, which question they're on. So to start off, it's going to have a 0 because we're going to have a multi-dimensional array, and the array, all arrays, start with an index of 0 by default. Now on this same line, we can initialize more variables that our application will require. So I'm just going to type in the variable name test, comma, test status, and these can be given values initially, just like we gave the pose variable an initial value of 0. You can give these initial values if you need to. And then question, that's another variable we're going to need. Choice, choices, choice A, choice B, choice C, and correct equals 0. Now a multi-dimensional array should be really fresh in your mind because we did a tutorial on it just yesterday. So hopefully you caught that tutorial. So next line we're going to do is create another variable, which is our multi-dimensional array. And it's going to have a variable name of questions, that's plural, because it's going to hold all of the questions. So you just put equals, open bracket, close bracket, semicolon. And now you have an empty array. So to make this a multi-dimensional array, let's just bring this bracket down a couple of lines. And then right here, let's indent a little bit and put another empty array, comma, go down one line, empty array, comma, go down another line, empty array, comma, go down another line, and empty array. On the last one, do not put a comma. Now what you have is a multi-dimensional array that has 4 empty array elements within it, because multi-dimensional arrays are simply an array that contains one or more arrays nested within it. These inner arrays are going to require, I think, 5 elements. Now I'll type in my first question. What is 10 plus 4? Now for multiple choice A, I'm going to have a 12. For multiple choice B, I'm going to have a 14. For multiple choice C, I'll have a 16. And if you want more multiple choices, you can just put more elements in this array. That way you can have multiple choice D and E and F and G, however many you want. And finally, in the last element, I'm going to put the answer. So if you say, what is 10 plus 4, you know that's 14, so the answer is B. So I'm going to put that there, B. So you see that structure? It's so simple and easy. I'll even space it out a little bit so you can see it better. Now realistically, most people who take your quiz or test online, they're not going to know how to program, and they're not even going to know that they can view the source code usually. So they're not going to be able to easily get the answer. But if a programmer or a coder happens to be taking your test, then they'll be able to easily get to these questions and answers. They'll be able to see your full open data sheet. That's why, like I said at the end of the video, I'm going to talk to you about hiding your questions and your answers. Really, the questions could be in the source code and the multiple choices, but really the answers is really what you want to make sure is secret and hidden. And I'll discuss that, don't worry about it. Alright, now I have all of my questions in place, and yours can have 50 questions or 1,000 questions. Alright, so underneath the questions array, I'm going to have a little function that I can use for just returning the document.getElementById reference to my scripts whenever they need it. So function underscore, that's the name of it. So anytime you see underscore leading a line in my code, you know that it's saying document.getElementById. It's just returning the object reference for the ID string. Now under that, we're going to place our very dynamic function named render question. Open close parentheses, opening curly brace, and closing curly brace. Now inside of this function render question is where the first question from this questions array is going to be populated to the page for the user to see, and it's going to put all the multiple choices there, and it's also going to have the submit button put there, and then when the user clicks the submit button, it's going to go to the next question. So the first thing we'll do in that function is get an object reference for the test element, which is this div right here, because we're going to populate its inner HTML with data. Now we're also going to put in the test status element inner HTML, we're going to write question position +1 of questions.length. So this is all very dynamic to where if you put 50 questions in this array, this is going to say 50. This is going to render the number 50. In my case, it's going to render the number 4 because I only have 4 questions. Now position, you can see by default starts at 0, so this is going to be 0 plus 1, so that's going to render a 1 there. So by default, when the application first loads, it's going to say question 1 of 4, and that's just to let the user know which question they're on and how many questions there are total. Now directly under that, we're going to populate some of our variables with data, so we'll take this question variable and this choice A, B, and C. So we'll actually put data in those variables now. Now if you're looking at this saying what the hell is he doing, just watch that multi-dimensional array tutorial where we showed you how to dig into your multi-dimensional array to get this targeted data that you want. So we know that pose is starting with an initial value of 0, so this is going to be a 0. All of these are zeros, and we're just targeting array indexes. This index you see here is targeting this element, this piece of data. That way this question, what is 10 plus 4, that string is going to be put into the question variable. Now the same for the choice A, choice B, and choice C variables. They're just going to get these next following array elements as their data. So these are the possible answers. These are the 3 possible answers that the user is going to see in the multiple choices. Now directly under that, in our little question box down here on the page, we're going to put the question. We're going to render the question to the user. Now we also need to have 3 input elements underneath the question that are the multiple choices, and those need to be radio buttons, or you can use checkboxes, whatever you want. I'm going to use radio buttons. So for the test inner HTML, we use plus equal for the rest of the data we want because we're appending to it. If we didn't put plus equal here, only the last line where you're affecting inner HTML, that's the only data that would wind up in it. So you have to make sure you use plus equal because that is appending to the data that you started here on this line. That's the only reason you see plus equal there. That way they get the question, and then under it they get the multiple choices. You can see I'm just using simple input radio buttons, and I gave them a name of choices. That way they're grouped together. Now the first choice has a value of uppercase A, second choice uppercase B, and the third choice is uppercase C. And that's how you can grade it. Now you can see in our multi-dimensional array the answer is B for this one. So the 14 you know is going to be here. When they choose that one, JavaScript will have the ability to get the value out of which one they chose out of this choices group. So out of the choices group, we'll be able to see if they chose A, B, or C when we go to check to see if their answer was correct or not. So we've got the question, we have our 3 multiple choices, and all we need is a button that will say submit answer. So here we have a button element with an on-click event that's going to run a function called check answer, and it has a label of submit answer. The user will see that on the button. It'll say submit answer, and then you can run the check answer function. Let's see, let's just put that function in place. Function check answer, and for now we'll just put an alert. We're going to change that in a minute, don't worry. Now if you were to run this right now, nothing would happen because this function is never being called to run. So we have to make this function run when the page is loaded. So when all of these elements are loaded into the DOM, then we can safely run this function called render question, and it will render the first question. So in order to do that, we're going to put window.addEventListener. We're going to listen for the load event, and then when the page is all loaded and all these elements are in the DOM, then the function render question is going to fire off. It's going to run. Now with this code in place, you can check your application in your favorite browser. So you see I get question 1 of 4 put into the test status element, and then the test element itself gets what is 10 plus 4, and then the multiple choices, and I can choose between those. I choose 14, and then I click submit answer, and it says okay, we will. Now we're going to work on this check answer function. Okay, inside of the check answer function, we're going to need some code that's going to look through this name group of choices to see which one the user has selected. And that just takes a few lines of code, and there's a for loop involved. I use my choices variable that we initialized way up here. So I use the choices variable, and what I'm going to do is put an array in there. When we use document.getElementsByName, what that does is it results in an array. Since we have a group with all have the same name, we're going to have an array of 3 elements, and they're going to be in this choices variable. So we can make a for loop that runs over that array, and then we're going to see basically what the user's choice is, whether it's A, B, or C. And choice will be put into this choice variable. That way you can evaluate it outside of this for loop now. And that's very easy to do. We're going to evaluate whether the choice that they selected is the correct choice or not. So we say if choice is equal to the questions multidimensional array, whatever question they happen to be on, and the last element in that array, which is these elements here. And these elements store the correct choice. So you're basically checking to see if what they chose matches the correct choice. Now if it does, we write correct plus plus, which increments our correct variable that we initialized up here. So as they go through the test, each time they get a question correct, this correct variable is going to increment, and it'll keep track of how many questions they are getting correct as they go. Now the very next thing we do is we say pose plus plus, and that changes the position of which question they're on. That means the position variable is now going to be a 1, which means the second question is going to be rendered into the test once we run this render question function again. So basically you can just keep firing off this render question function every time you want to put a new question on the page in sequence. But you have to make sure that the pose variable gets incremented by 1 before you run this function again. So that's why I put pose plus plus. And then for the very last line in this check answer function, we're going to make the render question function run again. So we increment the position of which question they're on, then we run the render question function again. That's what keeps the test flowing in sequence. The test questions, they keep coming in sequence that way. Okay, now I think we're at the point now where the test will flow, so we can check it. Let's give it the first answer was 10 plus 4, 14, submit. The next question comes up, and this changes to question 2 of 4. So what is 20 minus 9? That's 11. Submit answer. Then question 3 of 4 comes up. What is 7 multiplied by 3? 21. Submit answer. Then what is 8 divided by 2? That's 4. Now when I click submit answer here, watch what happens. It says question 5 of 4, and it's not giving me new questions. So what we'll need is a little if condition within our render question function here that's going to see if they are on the last question. If they're on the last question, then we want to grade the test. We're going to grade the test at the very end. You don't have to tell them whether they're getting each question right or wrong as they're going through each question. You can just let them take the test like normal, then at the very end you grade it. So really, you can program this any way you want. It could be to where that your program renders to the page whether or not they got the question correct that they just answered. And it'd be very easy to do that. You say if the choice is correct, right here is where you would just render to the page anything you want to say if it's correct. Or you could put an else condition here to render out that they got the question wrong. So pay attention. If you want to make the user see if they got the question right or wrong after each question is answered, then this is where you would put that kind of work. But mine is set up to just tell them what their grade is at the end. It's more like an exam, like a long exam. You would just take all the questions in sequence, and you don't get your grade until a few days later after the teacher can grade it. But ours will be an automatic process of grading, instant. So the first thing within that if condition is we're going to put in the test inner HTML, we're going to write you got correct of questions.length questions correct. Questions.length in my case is 4 because I only have 4 questions in my test. If yours was an exam with 50 questions, there would be a 50 there, and correct corresponds to how many questions they got correct out of the total amount of questions. So you can use these two numbers in any way you want with math to grade the test. So now I'll go down one more line and I'll put in the test status element inner HTML, we're going to write test completed. Then let's just bring the position back to 0 since the test is finished, and the correct variable can go back to 0. And actually you don't even have to put those back to 0 unless you want to allow them to restart the test. So these are only in place in case you want them to be able to restart the test. You want to make sure position goes back to 0 and the correct variable goes back to 0. And then finally we put return false here, and this is only to make sure that this function render question is not going to continue after this line. Because if you didn't put return false here, what would happen is this if condition will run and you'll say test completed, thank you, and all that crap, and then all of this code is still going to execute trying to put new questions into the test when you don't want that. So you just put return false and it stops this render question function from executing any further past this line. So now let's take the test. Question 1 of 4. What is 10 plus 4? That's 14. Submit answer. What is 20 minus 9? That's 11. Submit answer. What is 7 multiplied by 3? 21. Submit. What is 8 divided by 2? That's 4. Submit. Test completed. You got 4 of 4 questions correct. Now if I refresh the page, let's get all of those wrong, or maybe some of them wrong. Let's get this last one correct. Submit answer. Test completed. You got 1 of 4 questions correct. So you can use this correct and questions.length numbers to grade their test. And you can also give them a percentile if you want to give them a percentage number of how much they got right, or if you want their grade to be a percentage number. I have a tutorial on percent programming math. So the tutorial that I have about percent programming is all about math you can use to render a percent from a few variables that you have, from a couple of other numbers that you're working with. And maybe I'll put that on the screen or something. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so all of our programming's done, and on your own you can put a lot of bells and whistles and make it really feature rich if you want. And it's important for me to emphasize that there's probably 10 to 20 different ways that a programmer can go about creating an online exam. It can be programmed in so many different ways. Alright, so let's talk about now externalizing all of these questions, because you might wind up with 1,000 questions in your exam, which would be a little crazy, but some people might. And you can easily externalize that. And all you have to do is learn how to include JavaScript files into your source code. So basically, you just put a script tag here that says source equals, then you say QList QList.js. And what that'll do is include this question's multidimensional array, as long as you have it in a file called QList.js. So it's very simple to include external source files. So this array, if it happens to get really big and chunky, you can externalize it. Now let's discuss hiding these answers. If this is going to be a secure type thing, where an official test for a university or something like that, these answers need to be on the server hidden somewhere. Now what I would do is put them in a MySQL database or into a PHP file that can serve as a database, and your JavaScript can use AJAX to request any of the data in that PHP file. And you can use AJAX request to call to a PHP file that could connect to a MySQL database and get data out of MySQL database. Now really what I would do, if I was going to program an official test for a university or exams for a university to make sure the users can't cheat, is I would get each question one at a time from a MySQL database with an AJAX request. So when my page loads for the user to start taking the test, I would initially go and get question number 1 from a MySQL database table and then populate it into the question box. I wouldn't have all these questions and answers and everything sitting here. I would have one MySQL table that held all the answers, questions, multiple choices, and everything. And that's how I would deliver the content if it was to be a secure official exam. You just want to learn some way, shape, or form to make sure that these answers are not in your source code and that they're on the server hidden securely somewhere. And at the end of your test, what you can do is request all of the answers. You can also have another variable here that would be an array, an empty array, and what you do is push each answer that they chose, A, B, or C, into that array. So when they go through question 1, they choose B or C, the C is going to get packed into that array. And then the next question they take, that answer A, B, or C will be also packed into that. So what I'm saying is basically you can build an array that reflects all of the answers that they chose as they're taking the test. That way you could send that to the server and just compare it to the correct answers one by one, and that would happen in a loop. Okay, you're very aware now that your questions and answers could be viewed by smart people who know programming. So you want to make sure to take the proper steps. If it has to be a secure official exam, then take the proper steps and learn all the things you need to know to work with the data on the server using AJAX requests. Now in the case where you're going to MySQL with AJAX requests to get each question one at a time, you wouldn't need this multi-dimensional array. All you would need is a position variable to see which question you're on. That way you can go and get the correct question from the database as they progress through the test. And you would just be getting them one by one. So basically your database table could look like the fields in your database table. You can have a field of ID, and then you can have a field of question which can hold this question. Then you can have a field that says that's labeled CHA, CHB, CHC, and then finally a field in your database table for the correct answer. So your database table could pretty much look just like that, and you can request each set of data one at a time. And if you're doing all the checking, all the grading with an AJAX request to a PHP file, then they're not going to be able to see what's going on in the grading at all. Okay, now the last little subject I want to talk about is externalizing this data array. Now it doesn't even have to be a multi-dimensional array. It can be a JSON object, and we have a whole long series about programming JSON, so don't be scared to convert this to JSON because it's very easy to work with. But having a multi-dimensional array like this is a lot slimmer than a JSON object because each of these objects don't need keys. The attribute side of the values doesn't need to be there. It could be just a list of values like it is. If this was a JSON object, you would have to have a string that represents the data like this. It would have to say question and then colon, and then your question would be next to that. Then you would have to say option A colon 12, Option B, colon 14. So why do you need all this colon and extra string when you don't need it? Because JSON objects work with key value pairs. You have to have key value pairs in a JSON object, but in some programming situations you don't need the key. You don't need some little string that helps you identify what that piece of data is if you know as the programmer what the hell that piece of data is for. You really don't need some little string next to the data to tell you what it is. Now this data could also be populated from an XML file, or you could just use a multi-dimensional array like I did here, which is much slimmer in my opinion. So there's a whole bunch of different routes that you can go to externalize this data sheet, especially if you're going to have 50 questions. You're not going to want that in your source code. You can externalize it into an XML file, a JSON file. Hell, you could put it in a text file if you knew what you're doing. You know, consider all the different ways and maybe research all the different ways in which you can externalize your data sheets.
If you enjoyed the video you just watched, click on the subscribe button to tune into Adam's channel. He produces new videos on a regular basis. Below the subscribe button are a few more of his video tutorials that other viewers have found to be helpful or inspiring. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.